Welcome, everyone, to a journey through one of the most unsettling and enigmatic cases ever recorded in the history of Appalachia. Before we begin, share in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories reach. Today, we step back into the dark heart of North Carolina's mountains at the close of the 19th century, a time when isolation didn't just shape communities. It buried their secrets. It is the autumn of 1899. The Appalachian Mountains rise like ancient, silent sentinels, keeping watch over forgotten hamlets scattered among the mist and pines. Western North Carolina, in those days, was a region almost cut off from the rest of the world. Rough dirt roads twisted through fog-draped hills and narrow valleys where the sun rarely pierced the canopy. Families lived miles apart, their only connection being muddy trails that turned to rivers in the rain. Communication between villages depended on riders or wagons that took days to travel what we'd now consider a short distance. Back then, Watauga County was famed not only for its raw, untamed beauty, but also for its merciless isolation. Winters came early, overstayed their welcome, and left entire settlements imprisoned beneath drifts of snow that could mean the difference between life and death. People knew one another by family names that stretched back generations, and the reach of the law was faint, sometimes taking weeks to respond when summoned. Amid this harsh but haunting landscape lived Grace Hargrove, a 28-year-old woman who had made her home on a modest plot near the small village of Val Cruces, a name derived from Latin meaning Valley of the Cross. She had arrived 3 years prior, leaving behind the plains of eastern North Carolina, and quickly gained a quiet reputation as a skilled herbalist. Grace possessed an extraordinary understanding of medicinal plants, knowledge that made her indispensable to families who could not afford or access professional doctors. She brewed tinctures for fevers, prepared poultices for infected wounds, and mixed herbal teas that soothed ailments the medical science of her day could not explain. Yet, Grace carried more than her satchels of herbs. There was a weight in her demeanor, a melancholy that seemed to cling to her no matter how warm her smile. Her nearest neighbors, who lived nearly 3 miles away, remarked that she rarely spoke about her life before arriving in Val Cruces. If asked, she would politely change the subject, her tone soft but firm. This secrecy, innocent at first, gradually became the subject of whispers. Rumors traded in hushed tones at the small wooden church where the community gathered each Sunday. In the first days of October 1899, Grace was last seen alive by Thomas Whittaker, a local farmer who passed by her property on his way to the mill. He would later tell the county sheriff that she appeared unusually tense that day, her eyes darting constantly toward the tree line that surrounded her cabin. When he asked if something was wrong, Grace simply replied that she had sensed strange movements around her property for several nights, shadows and footsteps that would vanish when she tried to investigate. Whittaker, accustomed to the fears of those living alone in the wilderness, thought little of it and continued on his way. 3 days later, when Grace failed to deliver a promised batch of medicine to the Patterson family, who had a gravely ill child, alarm began to spread. Grace's reliability was well known. She never ignored a commitment, especially when a life depended on it. Mrs. Patterson sent her husband, Joshua Patterson, to check on her. What he found that cold, gray October afternoon would stay with him for the rest of his life. The door to Grace's cabin hung slightly open, creaking in the mountain wind. Inside, the small home was in chaos. Chairs were overturned, glass bottles shattered across the floor, and faint marks on the wooden walls hinted at a violent struggle. Yet Grace herself had vanished. It was as though the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. Patterson ran back to Val Cruces, breathless and terrified. Within hours, a search party formed. Men from nearby farms and villages combed the woods, climbed the surrounding ridges, and searched the icy creeks winding through the valleys. But no footprints, no blood, no piece of fabric, nothing was found. It was as if Grace Hargrove had simply ceased to exist. 2 days later, Sheriff William McBride of Watauga County arrived to investigate. A former Civil War veteran, McBride had witnessed scenes most men couldn't stomach. But what he found in that cabin unsettled even him. Beyond the wreckage of the struggle, there were peculiar details that seemed to whisper of something deeply wrong. On the kitchen table lay a worn leather-bound journal, open to an entry dated 2 days before Grace disappeared. Her handwriting trembled with fear as she described seeing figures moving among the trees at dusk, hearing footsteps circling her home at night, and feeling an oppressive presence watching her from the dark. At the bottom of the page, she mentioned recognizing someone among those shadows, but the name had been scratched out so violently that the paper had torn through. That missing name would become one of the most haunting clues in the entire case. McBride noticed that nearly all of Grace's personal items were untouched. Her clothes remained neatly folded in the closet, her modest savings were still tucked in a tin beneath her bed, and her herbal tools were carefully arranged on their shelves. Whoever had broken in wasn't after money or valuables. Their motive was something more intimate, something personal. Over the following days, the sheriff interviewed everyone who had ever spoken with Grace. That's when the contradictions began to surface. Some described her as gentle and kind-hearted, a woman of quiet grace. Others, however, hinted at darker rumors. They spoke of late-night visitors, muffled conversations overheard through open windows, and of a tall man seen leaving her property before dawn on several occasions. No one could agree on who he was. Some insisted he dressed like a city gentleman, others claimed he was a simple laborer. A few swore he rode a black horse, while others mentioned a discreet carriage. It was as though multiple men were being described, or perhaps as if witnesses were intentionally muddying the truth. By mid-October, the Watauga Democrat, the local newspaper, ran a cautious article about her disappearance, describing Grace as a valued member of the community whose absence had left neighbors deeply troubled. But away from print, the gossip grew far darker. Whispers suggested Grace had fled her past, that she had come to the mountains to escape someone or something. Sheriff McBride paid little mind to rumors, yet he knew that in a case so devoid of evidence, even the most far-fetched tales could conceal a sliver of truth. He sent telegrams to lawmen in surrounding counties and eventually to officials in eastern North Carolina, where Grace was said to have lived before moving west. The replies he received only deepened the mystery. Grace Hargrove, it turned out, was not her real name. She had been born Grace Thornton in 1871, the daughter of a well-respected merchant family in New Bern, North Carolina, and by 1893 Grace Thornton, as Sheriff McBride soon learned, had once been married to a man named Daniel Hargrove, a rising young lawyer known in New Bern for his sharp mind and his influential political ties. The marriage, according to the scant records that still existed, had come to an abrupt and mysterious end in 1896. The documents hinted at a separation, but there was no legal record of divorce, an extraordinary irregularity for a couple of their social standing at the time. Even stranger, Daniel Hargrove himself seemed to have vanished from the world at precisely that same moment. His once bustling law office in New Bern had closed overnight, his house sold without notice, and his name erased from the social and professional circles he had once moved through so confidently. Friends and colleagues offered a simple explanation, that he had left to pursue business in the Western Territories. But no one could say exactly where. It was as though the man had stepped into the shadows and never returned. When Sheriff McBride shared these revelations with Grace's former neighbors, their reactions were telling. Mrs. Martha Calloway, who lived several miles away and had formed a cautious friendship with Grace, hesitated before admitting something she had long kept to herself. Grace had once confessed that she was running from a painful chapter of her past, one she wished never to revisit. She had spoken of needing to start anew somewhere far away, in a place where no one knew her name or history, a place where she could simply live quietly. Yet, as McBride reflected grimly, peace was the one thing Grace Hargrove had never managed to find in those remote mountains. The final pages of her journal, which the sheriff studied over and over, were filled with dread so raw that even the faded ink seemed to tremble. Grace had written that he had found her, that he would not leave her in peace, that he had come to reclaim something she had tried desperately to bury in the past. Her words were fragmented, evasive, but charged with terror, a woman convinced that her past had caught up with her at last. Determined to follow the trail, McBride began searching the woods around her cabin more carefully. Roughly 200 yards from the house, along a nearly invisible path leading into dense forest, he found unsettling evidence that someone had been watching. The ground bore the charred remains of a small fire. Branches had been arranged into a crude shelter, and from that position, There was a perfect line of sight straight to Grace's kitchen window. Whoever had camped there had been observing her, waiting, studying her routines, perhaps even planning their moment. Among the ashes, McBride discovered the half-burned remains of several sheets of paper. He carefully salvaged what fragments he could. They appeared to be letters written in a refined, masculine hand. Though most of the pages were lost to fire, a few phrases could still be read. One chilling line stated, "You can't just vanish and expect me to accept it." Another read, "What we did must be settled, Grace. You can't run from it forever." The signature had been completely destroyed. McBride immediately sent the recovered fragments to Raleigh for forensic analysis, though he knew it would be weeks before any results came back. In the meantime, he pressed on, interviewing anyone who might have noticed unusual activity in the area. That was when he found Elijah Stone, a solitary hunter who lived deep in the mountains, nearly 6 miles from Val Crucis. Stone was known for his reclusive temperament and his unmatched knowledge of the forest trails. At first, he was reluctant to speak with the sheriff. Mountain folk valued their privacy, and Stone was no exception. But McBride's persistence eventually wore him down. When he finally spoke, what he described sent a chill through the sheriff. On the night of October 7th, the same night Grace was believed to have disappeared, Stone had seen something strange while returning from a hunting trip. Deep in one of the region's steepest valleys, he noticed the flicker of a lantern or flashlight weaving erratically through the darkness. What struck him was the hour. It was well past midnight, and the way the light moved, jerking and stumbling, as though whoever carried it was in distress or in a hurry. Stone hadn't investigated further. In those mountains, he explained, you learn not to meddle in other people's affairs. The wilderness had its own code, and curiosity could get you killed. But given the circumstances, he agreed to guide McBride to the place where he'd seen the light. The area was perilous, thick with undergrowth, riddled with ravines, and littered with loose rocks that made footing treacherous even in daylight. McBride organized multiple search teams composed of local volunteers. For 2 days they scoured the valley without success. Then, on the 3rd day, near a narrow waterfall where the stream dropped into a deep pool, one of the men called out. Wedged between stones on the riverbank were torn pieces of fabric. They matched perfectly the dress Grace had been wearing the last time Thomas Whittaker saw her. The fabric was ripped violently, and the surrounding mud bore signs of struggle, scuff marks, broken twigs, and scratches in the rock. McBride's expression hardened. Whatever had happened to Grace, it hadn't been an accident. He ordered the team to follow the river downstream. The water was fierce that season, swollen with autumn rain, and any body carried into it would have been swept away for miles. For a full week, the men searched tirelessly, uncovering only a few heartbreaking remnants: a silver brooch, which Mrs. Calloway confirmed as belonging to Grace, and a single Kate shoe found nearly 2 miles away. With no sign of a body, McBride turned his attention back to Grace's past. He made the long journey east to New Bern, determined to learn who Daniel Hargrove truly was and what had become of him. There, in the coastal town where the couple had once lived, he spoke to those who had known them during their short and troubled marriage. The portrait that emerged was troubling. Daniel, once regarded as a charming and ambitious attorney, was described by acquaintances as having a temper that burned hot behind closed doors. There were whispered accounts of fierce arguments echoing from their home, of Grace appearing at gatherings with tear-streaked eyes, and of her gradual retreat from society. A former housekeeper, now employed by another family, confided that she had witnessed moments of chilling tension between husband and wife. Disputes over hidden matters Daniel was determined to keep secret. The attorney who had managed their marital affairs, whatever they may have been, had died years earlier, and his records, according to his successors, had been destroyed in a suspicious fire in 1897. The timing was too perfect, too convenient to dismiss as coincidence. By now, McBride had come to believe that finding Daniel Hargrove was as vital as finding Grace herself. He sent telegrams to counties across the state, describing the man as he had been, about 35 years old, tall, dark-haired with a hint of grey at the temples, well-mannered and distinctly refined. Weeks passed without a single lead, until a message arrived from Burke County, midway between New Bern and Watauga. A man matching Daniel's description had been seen in Morganton during the summer of 1899. He had checked into a modest hotel under the name David Harrison and stayed for 3 weeks. The hotel manager remembered him clearly. The guest had asked a series of peculiar questions about travel routes into the western mountains, particularly those leading toward Watauga County. Even more unsettling, he had inquired about women living alone in the region, claiming to be searching for a distant relative. For Sheriff McBride, the implication was unmistakable. Whether under a false name or not, Daniel Hargrove had been hunting for Grace, and by the time autumn fell over the mountains, he had almost certainly found her. It soon became clear to Sheriff McBride that whoever had been searching for Grace had done so with great care and patience. The man had not acted impulsively. He had studied the land, mapped her routines, and waited for the right moment to strike. Yet a crucial question lingered in McBride's mind. What exactly was the man's purpose? Was he seeking reconciliation after years of separation? A confrontation born of bitterness? Or something far darker, perhaps retribution? Back in Val Crucis, the community found itself torn. Some neighbors still spoke of Grace with compassion, remembering her as a gentle soul who had helped their families through illness and hardship. Others, however, grew increasingly suspicious. They whispered that the missing woman had brought misfortune upon herself, that she had been hiding something all along. It was during this period of mounting speculation that Reverend Edmund Cole, the pastor of the small wooden church, came forward to speak with the sheriff. Cole explained that Grace had sought him out a few months before her disappearance, seeking spiritual guidance. She had not confessed to any crime, nor revealed specific details, but she had spoken of a deep, consuming guilt. Grace told him she had made decisions in her past that still haunted her, and that she feared the consequences would one day find her. Bound by the confidentiality of his pastoral duty, the Reverend could not reveal much more, but he told McBride that Grace had been genuinely distressed. She had even spoken of leaving the mountains altogether, perhaps heading west into Tennessee, or even farther, to start anew where no one would ever recognize her. Reverend Cole said he tried to comfort her, urging her to believe that faith and time could heal even the deepest wounds. But Grace's reply had chilled him. "Some pasts," she had said, "don't stay buried, no matter how hard you pray." Meanwhile, the physical search for Grace continued, though it had lost much of its early momentum. Small bands of volunteers still combed the surrounding wilderness, searching caves common to the Appalachian limestone region, peering into abandoned barns, and probing forgotten hollows in the forest. But as November came, the mountains began to change. Snow gathered on the higher ridges, turning the slopes white and making the air razor-sharp. The trails froze, rivers swelled, and each expedition became a battle against both nature and time. McBride knew the truth he dared not speak alive. If Grace was still alive and trapped somewhere in those mountains, every passing night reduced her chance of survival. Then, in December 1899, a new lead surfaced, an unexpected one. A traveling merchant passing through the sheriff's office brought with him a story that rekindled hope and dread in equal measure. He claimed to have seen a woman who strongly resembled Grace Hargrove in Asheville, nearly 40 miles south of Watauga, in the final days of October. She was accompanied by a tall, well-dressed man, and the two appeared to be engaged in a heated argument on a quiet side street. The merchant admitted he had not intervened. The argument had seemed private, even dangerous, but he distinctly remembered the woman trying to pull away as the man gripped her arm. When he looked back moments later, both were gone. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but weeks later, while stopping at a general store, he noticed a missing persons poster with Grace's likeness and felt compelled to come forward. McBride wasted no time. He made the journey to Asheville himself, determined to verify the claim. The town, larger and busier than Val Crucis, bustled with travelers, merchants, and railway workers. He spent days moving from business to business, questioning innkeepers, hotel clerks, railway attendants, and shopkeepers, showing them the portraits of Grace and Daniel. Several people thought they might have seen the woman, but their recollections were vague and uncertain, their descriptions too broad to be reliable. Still, McBride uncovered something worth noting. In the ledger of a modest hotel near Asheville's train station, he found an entry dated October 24th. A couple had signed in as Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, listing no permanent address. They had stayed for only one night before boarding a southbound train to Georgia the following morning. The clerk who had checked them in no longer worked there. He had since moved to another town, but the discovery nonetheless electrified the investigation. For the first time, there was a tangible indication that Grace might still be alive, though perhaps not of her own choosing. McBride immediately telegraphed law enforcement across Georgia, requesting that they check the registers of hotels, boarding houses, and railway stations along the southern route. But Georgia was vast, and without more information, the effort felt almost hopeless. Tracking 2 people among the thousands who traveled through the state each day was like searching for a single ember in a forest of ash. While waiting for word from the south, McBride turned his attention to an aspect of the case he had thus far overlooked: the medicines and tinctures Grace had left behind. He summoned Herbert Sinclair, an apothecary from Boone known for both his precision and his deep understanding of chemical compounds. Sinclair spent 2 full days examining the contents of Grace's shelves and the shattered bottles strewn across her cabin floor. Most of what he catalogued matched what one would expect from a practiced herbalist: remedies for fever, ointments for burns, teas for digestive ailments, and poultices for inflammation. Yet several vials stood out. These were not the common healing mixtures of a rural healer. They were something more complex. Sinclair identified certain plant-based extracts known to cause profound sleep, temporary confusion, and even feigned illness when used in calculated doses. When McBride pressed him for details, Sinclair explained cautiously that such substances weren't inherently illegal or immoral. In skilled hands, they could be vital medical tools, a way to ease unbearable pain or induce rest during surgery. But he also admitted, with quiet unease, that in untrained or malicious hands, those same preparations could prove extremely dangerous. Could Grace have used these on herself, or on someone else? McBride asked. Sinclair hesitated before answering. Possible, he said, but perilous. The dosages would have to be exact and the effects unpredictable. One mistake could cause unconsciousness or death. What unsettled the sheriff most was the quantity. Some bottles were nearly full, suggesting they had been prepared recently, yet rarely used. Why would a woman living alone keep such potent compounds in excess? That question opened a darker line of thought. Was Grace merely a victim, running from a violent man, or had she herself been concealing something? Could the same intelligence that allowed her to heal also enable her to harm? McBride revisited her journal with new eyes, searching for any mention of her craft that might hint at other motives. There, buried in an entry from June 1899, he found something intriguing. Grace had written about a woman from a distant settlement who came seeking help with a delicate matter. Grace hadn't explained the nature of the issue, but had noted that she provided her usual mixture for such occasions. The phrasing was careful, almost coded, but McBride, a man long accustomed to reading between the lines, understood what she meant. In remote communities where doctors were scarce and social condemnation swift, women sometimes turned to herbalists for remedies that society would never condone. That revelation did not make Grace a criminal, but it painted her in a new and complicated light. She had been operating in moral grayness, helping some, protecting others, perhaps crossing lines that the law of her time could not forgive. To some, she was a healer. To others, perhaps a dangerous woman. It also implied something far more consequential. Grace possessed knowledge of, and access to, substances that could be used for purposes extending well beyond ordinary medicine. McBride couldn't help but wonder whether Daniel Hargrove had ever known about this shadowed aspect of his wife's work. Perhaps that was the truth he had been so desperate to uncover, as suggested by the half-burned letters found among the ashes. Or perhaps the matter went deeper. Something bound to the core of their marriage, a secret both of them shared, and neither could bear to face. The winter of 1899 to 1900 was one of the harshest the mountains had seen in years. Snow gathered in thick, glittering layers, burying the valleys and silencing the forests. Temperatures rarely climbed above freezing, and for weeks, travel became nearly impossible. The search for Grace was officially suspended until spring, when the thaw would make it safe again to explore the remote ridges and hidden ravines. McBride continued to keep the case open on paper, updating his files and writing to nearby sheriffs, but in his heart, he knew the truth with every passing day. the likelihood of finding Grace alive grew dimmer. Then, in February 1900, a letter arrived that reignited his determination. It came from the sheriff of Fulton County, Georgia, home to the bustling city of Atlanta. The message reported that a woman resembling Grace Hargrove had been seen there in early November. This time alone, without the tall, well-dressed man who had last been spotted with her in Asheville. She had been looking for work as a housekeeper, introducing herself under the name Margaret Thornton. Enclosed with the letter were witness statements from 2 Atlanta families who had interviewed her. Their descriptions were strikingly precise. Her height, her eyes, the faint birthmark on her left wrist, all matched Grace's known details. The news brought a surge of hope but also fresh confusion. If this woman truly was Grace, what had transpired between her possible abduction or flight from Val Crucis and her solitary reappearance in Georgia's capital? And, more importantly, what had become of the mysterious man she had been seen quarreling with in Asheville? McBride longed to travel south at once, but the roads through the mountains remained treacherous with snow and ice. He resolved to wait until March, when the thaw would make the journey feasible. In the meantime, the enforced stillness gave him opportunity to dig deeper into the history between Grace and Daniel Hargrove. He began writing letters to lawyers, judges, and courthouse clerks across New Bern and neighboring towns, requesting any surviving records, however insignificant, that might illuminate the couple's past. Weeks passed, and most replies offered little new, either repeating information already known or explaining that older case files had been lost or destroyed in floods or fires. But one letter, from a retired attorney named Chester Baldwin, contained revelations that made McBride pause. Baldwin had once shared an office corridor with Daniel Hargrove during their early legal careers in New Bern. In his letter, he described Daniel as intelligent and ambitious, a lawyer with undeniable skill but an unrelenting hunger for prestige. He guarded his reputation obsessively and sought control not only over his professional image but over everyone in his orbit. According to Baldwin, Daniel's marriage to Grace Thornton had been widely regarded as a strategic alliance. The Thornton family's business influence opened doors that Daniel had long coveted. Yet, what began as a mutually beneficial union soon soared into something brittle and volatile. Baldwin recounted one afternoon in the summer of 1895, when he was closing his office and overheard raised voices from Daniel's adjoining room. He immediately recognized Grace's tone. Emotional, desperate, but resolute. She was saying something about no longer being able to live with this lie, insisting that the truth must come out. Daniel's reply had been quiet but laced with menace. Baldwin couldn't catch every word, but the tone chilled him. Moments later, Grace had emerged from the office pale and shaken, her eyes swollen as though she had been crying. After that day, Baldwin noticed a distinct change in both of them. Daniel grew withdrawn, irritable, and uncharacteristically reclusive, turning down lucrative cases and withdrawing from the social gatherings he once dominated. Grace, on the other hand, seemed to fade, losing weight, her laughter, her brightness. When Baldwin saw her in public after that, she appeared diminished, as if carrying an invisible burden too heavy to share. Baldwin also hinted at a quiet rumor that had long circulated among New Bern's legal circles. It concerned a fraud case from 1894, involving a prominent merchant accused of defrauding investors. Daniel had defended the man and achieved a surprising acquittal through what colleagues called a masterful argument. Yet whispers persisted that key pieces of evidence had mysteriously disappeared from the court record. No charges were ever brought, no proof ever surfaced, but the suspicion lingered. A faint stain on Daniel's otherwise polished career. Baldwin speculated that Grace might have uncovered something damning. Perhaps she had seen Daniel destroy documents, alter testimony, or bribe witnesses. If that were true, she would have been caught in an impossible moral snare. To expose her husband would mean public scandal and financial ruin. To stay silent would make her complicit in deceit. McBride found the theory disturbingly plausible. It explained so much: the abrupt breakdown of their marriage, Grace's decision to vanish completely, and Daniel's desperate determination to find her. If Grace held evidence, or even knowledge, of his corruption, she would represent an ever-present danger to him. For a man obsessed with status and control, that threat would be intolerable. Yet the sheriff also entertained another, darker hypothesis. What if Grace was not the victim in this story, but a partner? What if she had knowingly aided Daniel in his schemes, perhaps forging papers or using her intelligence and persuasive charm to manipulate witnesses? If so, their separation might have stemmed from betrayal over the spoils of crime, or from one turning against the other when conscience or greed demanded it. Grace's disappearance into the Appalachian wilderness could then be seen not merely as escape from a domineering husband, but as flight from justice itself. McBride knew he was walking the thin line between reason and conjecture. But with so few witnesses and so many missing records, speculation was an essential tool. He had to imagine multiple versions of the past if he hoped to uncover which one was true. By March 1900, the ice had begun to melt and the narrow mountain roads were finally passable. McBride set out for Atlanta, the journey taking nearly a week by a combination of train, wagon, and horseback. The city was a revelation, vibrant, rebuilt from its Civil War ruins and pulsing with commerce and ambition. There he met Sheriff Thomas Whitmore, a young but capable officer who had already taken the initiative to contact the two families who had interviewed the woman calling herself Margaret Thornton. McBride visited both homes personally, speaking with the women who had conducted the interviews. Their recollections aligned in remarkable detail. The same refined manner, the same soft, spoken intelligence, and the same subtle unease that had left an impression neither could forget. The accounts McBride gathered in Atlanta were remarkably consistent and rich in detail. The woman known as Margaret Thornton appeared to be in her early 30s. Refined in manner, articulate, and well-spoken, she displayed practical knowledge of household management and a competent grasp of basic medical care, as one would expect from someone with years of domestic and herbal experience. She claimed to have previously worked for several families in eastern North Carolina, yet when asked for specifics, names, locations, or dates, her answers grew vague. Pressed for references, she explained politely that her former employers had since relocated out of state, making contact difficult. One particular detail, however, seized McBride's attention. During one of the interviews, a potential employer recalled that the woman kept her gloves on throughout their conversation, even though they sat indoors beside a burning fire. When asked about it, she'd smiled nervously and said her skin was sensitive from constant exposure to cleaning agents. But the witness remembered a fleeting discomfort in her demeanor, as though the question had touched a nerve. McBride immediately thought of Grace's hands, marked with faint burns from years of working over open flames to prepare her tinctures and balms. Was this woman concealing those very scars beneath her gloves? What struck the sheriff even more was that Margaret Thornton never accepted a single job offer. She thanked each family graciously, saying she needed time to consider, promising to return within a few days, but she never came back. Her interviewers assumed she had found better work elsewhere, which was common in a rapidly growing city like Atlanta. Yet McBride sensed something different. To him, it seemed she had been testing the city, experimenting with the idea of a new life, only to decide it wasn't safe to stay. With the help of Sheriff Thomas Whitmore, McBride began combing through hotel and boarding house records from that same period. Their search turned up a single lead. Margaret Thornton had stayed at a modest guest house near the city's business district for just over a week in early November. The establishment's owner, Mrs. Eugenia Porter, a sharp-minded widow who prided herself on discretion, remembered her boarder vividly. According to Mrs. Porter, the woman was reserved and self-contained. She spent most of her time in her room, emerging only for simple meals or short solitary walks around the block. Yet the landlady recalled something that now seemed significant. On more than one occasion, she had seen her guest standing by the upstairs window, gazing anxiously at the street below. The woman's expression, Mrs. Porter said, was not of idle curiosity but of watchfulness, perhaps even fear. Once, when a tall man in a dark overcoat passed by the boarding house, the woman had abruptly stepped back from the window as if to avoid recognition. At the time, Mrs. Porter had thought little of it, choosing not to intrude on a paying guest's privacy. When the woman finally left, she did so quietly. She left her room immaculate, settled her bill in full, and departed without mentioning her next destination. The only odd thing Mrs. Porter recalled was her luggage, a single small suitcase, far too light for someone planning to begin a new life in a new city. It was, McBride noted grimly, the luggage of a traveler who never intended to stay. McBride remained in Atlanta for 3 additional days, circulating sketches and descriptions of both Grace and Daniel Hargrove at railway stations, stagecoach offices, and local businesses that served travelers. Several clerks thought they recognized the woman described, but their recollections were vague and uncertain. No one could say what had become of her after leaving Mrs. Porter's boarding house. As for Daniel, there was no trace at all, no record, no sighting, no name that matched his description. If he had been in Atlanta, he had taken great care to vanish without leaving a footprint. The central mystery still loomed. What exactly had happened between Grace's disappearance from Val Crucis and her solitary reappearance in Atlanta? If Daniel had indeed taken her from Asheville to Georgia, as the hotel record implied, then why was she traveling alone mere weeks later? Had she escaped him? Had he released her? Or had something far darker occurred along the way, something that left only Grace alive to continue on her own? An unsettling possibility began to form in McBride's mind. What if Daniel Hargrove was already dead? Grace, desperate and terrified, had both the means and the knowledge to defend herself. Her expertise with herbs and extracts gave her access to compounds that could sedate or kill, if used in sufficient concentration. If Daniel had forced her to accompany him, and she had found a moment to act, would she have used such knowledge to secure her freedom? It was a chilling, but plausible theory. It would explain Daniel's abrupt disappearance from all public record, Grace's anxious but independent presence in Atlanta, her constant vigilance, and her unwillingness to remain in one place. Yet it also carried troubling moral weight. If Grace had indeed caused her husband's death, even out of self-preservation, she would still be a fugitive in the eyes of the law. And if her act had been deliberate rather than defensive, then McBride's case was not a search for a missing woman, but a hunt for a killer. When McBride returned to Watauga County in April 1900, he carried more questions than answers. He compiled a detailed report of his findings and distributed it to law enforcement agencies across several states, urging them to report any sightings of individuals matching either Grace's or Daniel's descriptions. He even authorized a modest county expense to hire a private investigator in Atlanta, someone who could discreetly monitor railway arrivals and guest registries for any trace of the elusive woman. Back in Val Crucis, Grace's cabin stood abandoned, slowly surrendering to the mountain weather. Her once orderly herb garden had turned to wilderness, with vines and weeds overtaking the beds where medicinal plants had once thrived. Locals spoke of the place in hushed tones, saying it felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by questions that refused to rest. Many avoided walking past it after nightfall. The silence of the cabin, the emptiness of its windows, seemed to carry a weight of unfinished truth. McBride continued to revisit the site throughout the spring and summer, often alone, scanning the property for anything overlooked in earlier searches. It was during one of these solitary visits, in June 1900, that he stumbled upon something that would change the direction of the investigation entirely. While examining a small outbuilding Grace had used to store her dried herbs and glassware, McBride noticed several floorboards that looked slightly out of alignment, recently removed and replaced. The marks were faint but undeniable to a practiced eye. He carefully pried them up and discovered a hollow cavity beneath the floor. Inside lay a tightly sealed metal container. His pulse quickened as he lifted the lid. Inside were a bundle of letters bound with a faded ribbon, a small ledger filled with cryptic entries, and, most startling of all, a loaded pistol of modest caliber. At the bottom rested a photograph of Grace and Daniel on what appeared to be their wedding day, both youthful, radiant, and utterly unaware of the darkness that would come. The letters concealed within that metal box revealed an entirely new layer to their relationship, one that none of the witnesses or acquaintances had ever hinted at. Written between 1893 and 1896, they chronicled the gradual unraveling of a marriage that had once promised love, but decayed into fear and control. The earliest letters, sent by Daniel while traveling on business in Charleston, were tender and eloquent, filled with promises of devotion and a shared future. Yet, woven between those affectionate lines were subtle shadows of possessiveness, faint signs that Daniel viewed Grace less as a partner and more as something he owned. But with time, the tone of his correspondence changed dramatically. The tone of Daniel's letters shifted sharply as the years passed. The warmth and charm that once filled his early correspondence gradually gave way to unease, then to full-blown paranoia. He wrote obsessively about threats to his reputation, about unseen enemies scheming to destroy him, and about the need for Grace to remain silent about certain matters. His words became cryptic and controlling, filled with veiled commands and fragments of secret dealings that he never fully explained. Repeatedly, he warned her to remember the things we discussed, and the truths only you must keep. One letter dated March 1895 chilled McBride to the core. Daniel had written, "You are the only person alive who could ruin me entirely, and for that reason, I must be absolutely certain of your loyalty." The implication behind the words was unmistakable, a threat disguised as affection. But what truly unsettled McBride were not Daniel's words, but Grace's. Hidden among the letters in the tin were several she had written but never sent. Drafts she had kept for herself, perhaps to clarify her thoughts or to serve as a record in case she ever needed to defend her name. These unsent letters revealed a horrifying story. In one, written during the summer of 1894, Grace described stumbling upon a collection of documents while tidying Daniel's private study. To her horror, they proved that her husband was not merely a lawyer defending dubious clients. He was an active participant in a network of fraud and forgery, creating fake land titles and falsifying evidence to protect the interests of wealthy associates. His entire professional success, she realized, rested on deception. When Grace confronted him, she had hoped for a confession tinged with remorse. Instead, Daniel admitted everything with chilling calm. He justified his crimes as the natural order of things, claiming that only the clever and ruthless prospered in a corrupt world. When she threatened to expose him, his demeanor changed instantly. The charming husband became cold, methodical, and cruelly logical. He told her that if he fell, she would fall with him. To ensure it, he had already forged her signature on several incriminating documents, weaving her name into his web of deceit. On paper, she appeared to be complicit, his unwilling partner in crime. If she tried to denounce him, he would make sure she faced ruin and prison right beside him. Then, in a letter dated September 1895, Grace recorded something even darker, an event that haunted her until the day she vanished. She wrote that Daniel had once brought home a man he called only the associate, a figure clearly tied to his criminal operations. Late that night, Grace overheard a conversation through the thin walls of their home. The two men were discussing a witness, someone who had become a problem for Daniel's schemes. Their words were muffled, but their intent was unmistakable. They weren't talking about bribery or persuasion. They were talking about eliminating the man. Weeks later, Grace read in the newspaper that a businessman involved in one of Daniel's land cases had gone missing without a trace. The case was eventually abandoned for lack of evidence. From that moment, she wrote, she could no longer deny the truth. Her husband was not only a fraud, he was capable of far worse. She became physically ill with dread and began, quietly and carefully, to plan her escape. But courage came slowly. It would take her many months to find the strength and means to act. The small ledger found in the metal box seemed at first an indecipherable collection of numbers and symbols. But McBride was patient. Night after night, he studied it by lamplight, tracing the repeating figures, looking for connections. Gradually, the pattern revealed itself. It was Grace's secret record, a painstaking attempt to document Daniel's criminal finances. Each coded entry represented hidden payments, false transfers, or unexplained withdrawals. Some were routed through accounts in other cities, others simply vanished. The deeper McBride looked, the clearer it became that Grace had discovered a trail of corruption that could have destroyed her husband's reputation forever. Particularly telling were several entries from late 1895 and early 1896, records of large payments made to an individual identified only by the initials JC. The sums were substantial, far exceeding any legitimate legal fee. The timing of those payments matched precisely with the period when the missing merchant had last been seen alive. McBride couldn't prove it beyond doubt, but he began to suspect that J.C. Wack, Daniel's mysterious associate, was the same man Grace had overheard that terrible night. Then there was the pistol, a small loaded revolver tucked beneath the letters and ledger. It spoke volumes without a single word. Grace had clearly lived in genuine fear of what Daniel might do if he found her. The gun was her last defense, hidden where even he would not think to look. Its location, sealed away under the floorboards, suggested she had concealed it long before her disappearance, perhaps sensing she might need to flee suddenly, with no time to return for it. Among the contents of the hiding place was another object that, at first glance, seemed trivial, a delicate silver locket containing the photograph of an older woman bearing a striking resemblance to Grace. On the back was engraved, "To my dear daughter, with eternal love, Mother." McBride already knew from prior research that Grace's mother had died when she was 16. The locket, then, was almost certainly her most treasured possession, something she would never have left willingly behind unless she had no other choice. With these discoveries, McBride's entire understanding of the case transformed. Grace was no longer merely a frightened wife escaping an abusive marriage. She was a witness to serious crimes, perhaps even murder, who had quietly compiled evidence to protect herself. The hidden cash was her insurance, proof she could use if she needed to bargain for safety or clear her name. The fact that she had abandoned it only confirmed that her final departure from Val Cruces had been sudden and forced. Now, the pieces began to align. McBride reconstructed the events of October 1899 with new clarity. Daniel Hargrove, under the alias David Harrison, had tracked Grace to Val Cruces after years of searching. He had been camping in the woods near her cabin, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. His partially burned letters suggested that he had first tried persuasion, urging her to reconcile or at least cooperate. When that failed, he had resorted to violence. The chaos left inside the cabin told its own story, a struggle, a confrontation, a desperate attempt by Grace to resist. Daniel had subdued her, likely through force or threats, and compelled her to leave with him. Together they traveled to Asheville, where witnesses later recalled seeing them. Their registration as husband and wife at the hotel did not mark a reconciliation. It was an act of coercion. Daniel had a plan. He was taking Grace somewhere, perhaps to extract the remaining evidence she still held or to force her to sign papers absolving him. But somewhere between Asheville and Atlanta, the situation changed. Whether by chance, cunning, or sheer desperation, Grace managed to break free. Her appearance in Atlanta, alone, anxious but alive, proved she had escaped. Yet her behavior there told the rest of the story: the gloves to hide her scars, the restless watching from the window, the constant fear of being followed. She was a woman on the run, uncertain whether the man she had fled was still pursuing her. McBride now returned to the theory that had first haunted him in Atlanta, but with new weight behind it. Grace may have used her knowledge of medicinal compounds to defend herself during that journey, possibly even to end Daniel's life. She had the expertise, the opportunity, and, above all, the motive. McBride began to see a possible sequence of events forming in his mind. If Daniel had truly forced Grace to travel with him, perhaps intending to silence her for good, she may have realized that her only hope of survival lay in taking action first. The various preparations she had kept in her cabin, some of which the local apothecary had identified as lethal if concentrated, might have been carried with her on that journey. It would not have been difficult to slip a small amount into Daniel's drink or food when his guard was down. The possibility that Grace Hargrove had taken her husband's life, if indeed she had done so, placed Sheriff McBride in a difficult position both morally and legally. By the letter of the law, such an act would be considered murder, regardless of the circumstances. Yet, the evidence now before him told the story of a woman who had endured years of mistreatment, who had uncovered her husband's criminal dealings, who had lived in constant fear, and who had finally been pursued across several states by a man clearly capable of violence. The law was rigid and unyielding, but McBride had always been a man who valued justice over technicalities. Finding Grace was no longer simply about solving a mystery. It was about understanding what truly happened and determining whether justice, in its deeper sense, had been served. Recognizing that she might have fled far beyond Georgia, McBride broadened his search. If Grace was indeed on the run, she wouldn't have lingered long in Atlanta. She would have kept moving, always staying ahead of danger. Whether from Daniel, if he had somehow survived, or from the authorities, if she had committed a crime in desperation. McBride sent telegrams to sheriffs throughout the South, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, and even Texas, providing a detailed description of Grace, including her use of aliases such as Margaret Thornton. He requested that they report any lone woman recently arriving in their towns seeking work as a housekeeper, nurse, or herbalist. By midsummer 1900, replies began to trickle in. Most were frustratingly inconclusive. Several officers reported women who roughly fit the description, but none of the leads held up under scrutiny. There were simply too many women traveling alone across the South in those years. Widows, wanderers, or those seeking to rebuild their lives. Finding one woman among thousands was like chasing smoke. Then, in August of that year, a letter arrived that seized McBride's attention. The sheriff of Mobile, Alabama, a thriving port city on the Gulf of Mexico, reported that a woman resembling Grace had worked briefly in a medical clinic the previous winter under the name Mary Thornton, an alias suspiciously close to one Grace had used before. The doctor who employed her, a man named Dr. Samuel Blackwell, remembered her clearly. She had displayed exceptional knowledge of herbal remedies and handled even the most difficult patients with rare composure and skill. Yet, after only 3 weeks, she had left abruptly, claiming an urgent family matter required her to return north. Determined to follow the lead, McBride traveled to Mobile that September, a grueling journey of nearly 2 weeks by train and steamer. The port city was alive with noise and color, a meeting place of merchants, sailors, and drifters from across the world. It was exactly the kind of place where a person could vanish without a trace. Dr. Blackwell received McBride at his modest but tidy clinic, which mostly served dock workers and their families. The physician confirmed every detail. Mary Thornton had indeed worked for him in late 1899. She was intelligent, quiet, and astonishingly capable for someone without formal medical schooling. She could identify herbs he had never heard of, prepared tinctures with scientific accuracy, and seemed to have a natural gift for easing pain. When McBride showed him a photograph of Daniel and Grace on their wedding day, the doctor's eyes lit with recognition. Though she had appeared more frail and haunted when he knew her, it was unmistakably the same woman. Blackwell also shared a detail that troubled him. Despite Mobile's humid heat, Mary always wore long sleeves. Once, while reaching for a jar on a high shelf, he glimpsed bruising around her wrists, marks consistent with having been tied. When he gently asked about them, she quickly pulled down her sleeve and changed the subject. The doctor further recalled that she had been unusually curious about ships departing from Mobile. She had asked about destinations such as the Caribbean, Mexico, and even South America. At the time, he assumed she was planning a temporary trip for family reasons. Looking back, he now suspected she had been preparing to disappear entirely. McBride spent several exhausting days combing through shipping company records, speaking with harbor masters, and checking incomplete passenger manifests from late December 1899 through January 1900. Many names appeared, but none could be definitively linked to Grace. Then, while nursing a drink at a dockside tavern popular with old sailors, he met Captain Jeremiah Stone, a weathered mariner who offered a revelation. Stone had commanded a cargo vessel running between Mobile and Veracruz, Mexico. His ship rarely carried passengers, but in December 1899, a lone woman had begged passage, offering generous payment to travel unofficially. She had no proper papers and seemed desperate to leave quickly. Though Stone usually refused such arrangements, her demeanor, terrified yet dignified, had convinced him she wasn't a criminal, but someone fleeing danger. He had allowed her aboard, recording her only as Mrs. T in the ship's log. During the 5-day voyage, she kept mostly to herself, eating alone and speaking little. On their final night before docking, she thanked him for his kindness and mentioned her intention to travel deeper into Mexico, perhaps even to Central America, to start a new life. When asked if she was running from the law, she replied quietly, "I am running from a situation no court would understand. My life depends on distance." When the ship reached Veracruz on December 28, 1899, she disembarked with a single small suitcase and vanished into the crowds. McBride was left with mixed emotions, relieved to finally trace her trail yet disheartened that it led beyond his reach. Everything matched the timing, her description, her desperate need for escape. He was certain the mysterious passenger was Grace Hargrove. But now she was somewhere in Mexico, perhaps further south, far from American jurisdiction and nearly impossible to find. Still, McBride couldn't bring himself to abandon the case. He knew he was close to the truth, and that truth, whatever it was, would not rest quietly until it was found. McBride considered his next move carefully. He could attempt to contact the Mexican authorities, but experience had taught him that cross-border cooperation in such matters was slow, tangled in bureaucracy, and rarely produced results, especially when no formal criminal charges had been filed. Declaring the case closed as an unresolved disappearance would have been far easier, and few would have questioned that decision. Yet something continued to gnaw at him. One question refused to let go: where was Daniel Hargrove? If Grace had escaped his grasp, then what had become of the man who had pursued her with such relentless obsession? Determined to find answers, McBride decided to shift his focus. If Grace could not be found, perhaps Daniel could. Somewhere between Asheville and Atlanta, something crucial had happened. Something that might explain everything. So, the sheriff returned to North Carolina, retracing the same railway route that wound its way south through the Appalachian foothills into northern Georgia. At each stop, he questioned station clerks, hotel owners, boarding house keepers, and merchants, hoping someone might remember seeing the couple in the autumn of 1899. Most of the answers were vague or unhelpful. Nearly a year had passed, and countless travelers had come and gone. Then, in the small town of Toccoa, Georgia, his persistence finally paid off. There he met Heinrich M. Müller, a meticulous German hotel proprietor known locally for his sharp memory. When McBride showed him the photograph of Daniel and Grace, Müller studied it intently before nodding. Yes, he remembered them. The couple had stayed in his modest inn for 2 nights in mid-October of the previous year. Their appearance was ordinary, but their behavior was not. What had stuck in Müller's mind was the oppressive tension between them. The man had checked in using a false name, something like Harrison or Henderson. The woman said nothing, keeping her eyes downcast while the man gripped her arm tightly, not in affection, but in control. She looked utterly exhausted, as though sleep and safety had long been strangers to her. Müller admitted to McBride that the atmosphere between them had made him uncomfortable, but in those days, it was considered improper to interfere in a couple's private affairs. That first night, other guests complained about shouting from their room. When Müller went upstairs to quiet them, he paused outside the door and overheard a fierce argument. The man's voice was low and threatening, demanding that Grace tell him where she had hidden the remaining evidence against him. Her replies shifted from desperate pleading to cold defiance, insisting that he would never find it. When Müller knocked, the argument stopped abruptly. The door opened only a few inches, just enough for the man to assure him that everything was fine and that there would be no further disturbances before shutting it again. The next morning, Müller noticed Grace had a red mark on her neck, partially hidden beneath a scarf. When she bent down to pick something up, the fabric slipped slightly, revealing what looked unmistakably like the imprint of a hand. The man shadowed her constantly, never allowing her a moment alone, not even when she went to the hotel's common washroom. His behavior struck Müller as deeply troubling, though again he kept his distance. On their second night, something strange occurred. Around 10 o'clock, as Müller was closing the front hall, he heard a heavy thud from upstairs, followed by a long, unnatural silence. He hesitated for several minutes, expecting further noise, but none came. Worried that someone might be hurt, he climbed the stairs and knocked on their door. There was no response. Only after his second, louder knock did he hear faint movement and slow, shuffling steps. When the door finally opened, the woman stood alone. What Müller saw unsettled him deeply. Grace, though he knew her then only as the guest, appeared pale and trembling, her breathing quick and shallow, her eyes wide and unfocused. Her hands shook as she gripped the doorframe. She insisted that everything was fine, claiming she had dropped a heavy trunk from the closet and startled herself. Her husband, she said, had stepped out for fresh air. The explanation felt rehearsed. When Müller tried to peer into the room, she subtly shifted to block his view. Her tone grew sharper, defensive, as she repeated that she needed no help. Reluctantly, he left her and returned downstairs, but remained alert for any further sounds. None came. The rest of the night passed in complete silence. At dawn the next morning, the woman came down to the lobby alone, carrying a small suitcase. She paid the bill with trembling hands, placing the coins on the counter without looking up. She told Müller her husband had left before sunrise on urgent business, and that she would join him later at the station. Her manner was anxious, evasive. She avoided eye contact, her answers inconsistent. She first mentioned they were heading to Atlanta, then quickly corrected herself, claiming they were bound elsewhere. Mumler also noticed that she wore a different dress from the day before, and that parts of the fabric seemed slightly damp, as if hastily washed. A faint chemical smell hung around her, something sharp and medicinal that he couldn't identify. She departed soon after, glancing back at the building several times, her expression a mix of fear and vigilance. What truly cemented the memory in Amyla's mind, and what he now recounted to McBride with visible unease, was what he discovered after her departure. The room was unnaturally clean, far cleaner than most guests ever left it. The bed had been stripped and remade with fresh linens, though he had not supplied any replacements. When he checked the laundry bin, he found the original sheets rolled tightly together, still damp as if recently washed. Under the bed, he noticed fine traces of white powder, partially smeared across the floorboards, as though someone had tried to clean it hastily but couldn't reach beneath the heavy frame. There were also faint drag marks on the wooden floor, subtle but unmistakable, leading from the center of the room toward the window. At the time, Mumler had dismissed the oddities and cleaned up without giving them much thought. But now, recounting the details to Sheriff McBride nearly a year later, he realized just how unsettling they were. The white residue, the washed sheets, the strange quiet, all of it hinted at something far darker than a domestic quarrel. McBride listened intently, a cold weight settling in his chest. When he asked Mumler whether any sample of the powder had been kept, the hotelier shook his head regretfully. He had swept it up and thrown it out with the rest of the trash, never imagining it might one day matter. The sheriff's mind churned with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Whatever had happened in that small hotel room in Toccoa, it had marked the point where Grace Harrove's flight truly began, and where Daniel Harrove's trail seemed to end. It was a devastating loss of potential evidence, yet Sheriff McBride was confident he could piece together what had occurred in that hotel room. Grace, with her deep knowledge of medicinal herbs and chemical compounds, had likely concocted something from her private stock and administered it to Daniel on that second night, perhaps hidden in his food or drink once his guard was down. The heavy thud that Mueller had reported hearing must have been the sound of Daniel collapsing under the effects of the substance. McBride questioned Mueller closely for additional specifics. What floor had the couple's room been on? Mueller explained that it was on the second floor, its window overlooking the narrow back alley that led toward the wooded edge of the property. The area was quiet and hidden, particularly at night when the nearby businesses had already closed. McBride insisted on examining the room immediately, even though he knew it had been used by countless travelers since the incident. Mueller led him there, a plain, practical space furnished with an iron bed, a wooden chair, a small table, and a porcelain basin. McBride inspected every corner with painstaking care. He shifted furniture, ran his fingers along cracks in the floorboards, and tapped gently on the walls for any hollow sound. Then, wedged behind a heavy cabinet in a narrow gap thick with dust, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. A small, dark glass vial. It was empty, but a residue of crystallized liquid clung to its base. The vial was precisely the kind used by herbalists for concentrated plant tinctures. McBride wrapped it carefully in his handkerchief and stored it safely away. Next, he examined the window. It opened wide, revealing a drop of roughly 4 meters to the alley below, not high enough to be fatal, but certainly enough to cause injury. Descending to the alley, he began scanning the ground. The surface was compacted dirt, littered with stones and patches of wild growth. He was about to abandon the search when something caught his eye. Near the wall, half covered by weeds, was a patch of soil that looked different, fresher, as though it had been disturbed long ago and slowly reclaimed by nature. Using a fallen branch, McBride began to dig carefully. Within minutes, about a foot down, he uncovered fabric, a dark overcoat, the kind worn by a well-to-do gentleman on his travels. The material was weathered, damp and stained, but recognizable. More fragments appeared as he dug, pieces of clothing that clearly matched the same outfit. Realizing the gravity of what he'd found, McBride stopped at once and telegraphed state authorities, urging them to send a professional excavation team. Over the next several days, while awaiting their arrival, McBride continued gathering testimonies in Toccoa. He questioned townsfolk, business owners, and travelers who might recall anything from that October night a year prior. A coachman who worked near the hotel remembered seeing a woman leaving through the back late at night, carrying something heavy wrapped in a dark cloth. It had struck him as odd, but he hadn't interfered. Another nearby resident mentioned hearing digging sounds in the alley before dawn, assuming it was animals or routine hotel maintenance. When the specialized team from Atlanta finally arrived, they conducted a thorough excavation. Their findings confirmed McBride's darkest suspicions. Beneath the surface lay more than just clothing, an empty leather wallet, a shattered pocket watch, and deeper still, fragments of human bone. The remains were partial but unmistakably human. A medical expert on site concluded that they likely belonged to a strong, adult male, though the quantity was too little to represent a full skeleton. The discovery fueled two possible theories. Either Grace had buried Daniel's belongings to divert suspicion and hidden the rest elsewhere, or in her haste and fear that night, she managed to conceal only part of the body before fleeing. For the next few weeks, McBride scoured every record he could find in search of Daniel Hargrove's trace after October 1899. He sent telegrams to jurisdictions across the country, requested death and hospital records, investigated reports of unidentified men, and searched for any hint of financial or written activity. Nothing emerged. It was as though Daniel Hargrove had simply been erased from existence. Grace's trail was just as cold. After she departed Mobile for Mexico, no reliable sighting was ever confirmed. Captain Jeremiah Stone, who had transported her to Veracruz, remained the last known person to see her alive. McBride tried coordinating with Mexican authorities, but bureaucracy and language barriers made progress nearly impossible. A woman with Grace's intelligence, resources, and determination could easily vanish in such a vast country. Then, in November of 1900, everything changed. McBride received an unexpected letter from a New Orleans attorney named Ezra Beaumont. The lawyer explained that a woman claiming to be the rightful owner of a property in Veracruz, registered under the name Grace Hargrove, had contacted him. She provided authentic documentation and requested that the property be sold, with the proceeds forwarded to an address in Mexico City. McBride traveled to New Orleans immediately. Beaumont, a precise and cautious man, showed him the letters and supporting papers. The handwriting was unmistakably Grace's, matching the diaries and letters McBride had examined before. The property details were exact, knowledge only the true owner could possess. There was no room for doubt. Grace Hargrove was alive and residing somewhere in Mexico. Then Beaumont handed him something else, a sealed letter addressed personally to Sheriff William McBride of Watauga County. The envelope was aged and marked with Grace's familiar penmanship. With trembling hands, McBride broke the seal and began to read. The letter was lengthy and meticulously written, its elegant penmanship unmistakably matching the style McBride had come to recognize from Grace's diaries. She began by expressing gratitude for his persistence and professionalism, acknowledging that she was fully aware of how long he had been following her trail. Then, in a tone that hovered between confession and justification, she recounted her own version of the events of October 1899, her final days with Daniel Hargrove. Grace claimed that Daniel had confronted her in Veracruz and, under explicit threats to her life, had forced her to accompany him. His plan, she wrote, was to take her somewhere remote, far from help, where he could coerce her into revealing the location of the incriminating evidence she possessed against him. And then, once he had what he wanted, kill her to protect his secrets. Throughout their journey northward, Daniel's demeanor had swung wildly between hollow promises of reconciliation and violent threats meant to intimidate her into submission. By the second night in Toco, Grace wrote, she had realized that there was only one way to survive. Using the few chemical substances she had managed to conceal, she prepared a mixture that would first induce deep sleep and then gradually paralyze vital functions. Pretending she wished to talk calmly, she brewed tea for them both, insisting that they needed peace of mind before continuing their journey. Confident in his dominance, Daniel drank it without suspicion. Within 20 minutes he began to weaken, and an hour later he was unconscious. By dawn his heart had stopped. Grace described what followed in chillingly clinical detail. She checked several times to ensure he was truly dead, then sat frozen trembling as the reality of what she had done took hold. Fear and instinct soon replaced shock. She scrubbed every surface that might bear traces of the drug, changed the bed linens, and washed the floorboards. But Daniel's body was an impossible problem. She was physically too small to move it alone, and she knew attempting to drag a corpse through the hotel would draw attention. In the pre-dawn panic, she made what she called a desperate and dreadful decision. With the small knife she always carried for protection, she cut away certain pieces of his clothing and gathered some personal effects. Then, under the faint light of morning, she threw a few identifiable items out the window into the alley below, along with small pieces she could manage, burying them quickly in the soft soil behind the hotel. The rest, she admitted, she left wrapped in a rug beneath the bed, hoping it would remain undetected long enough for her to flee. Her plan had been to return later to dispose of it properly, but terror overcame resolve. She fled first to Atlanta, then to Mobile, and finally across the Gulf to Mexico. Grace's tone never pleaded for forgiveness. She stated clearly that she did not regret what she had done, only that it had come to that point. She wrote that Daniel had made her life a torment, that his cruelty and threats had left her no other option. She reminded McBride of the era's reality, that no court would ever believe a woman's word over a man of Daniel's stature, that the justice system offered her no protection. She had, in her words, chosen survival over submission. Grace ended the letter with a quiet plea. She begged McBride to let the matter rest, to stop searching for her, and allow her to live out her remaining years in peace. She wrote that she had devoted herself to aiding the poor in rural Mexico, using her knowledge of herbs and medicine to heal rather than harm. Dragging the case into the public eye, she warned, would only reopen old wounds, ruin innocent lives, and expose dangerous secrets involving influential men Daniel had defrauded. Let the dead rest. Sheriff, she concluded. Let the living begin again. And McBride read the letter 3 times, each reading deepening his inner conflict. His oath as a lawman demanded that he uphold justice, that no killing go unanswered. Yet as a man, one who had spent months unraveling the tangled history of Grace and Daniel, he could not help but see her as both victim and survivor. The more he reflected, the clearer it became that this was not a case of cold-blooded murder, but of a woman pushed past every conceivable limit. In the months that followed, McBride struggled with what to do. His official report meticulously documented his findings, but left key conclusions intentionally ambiguous. He recorded the remains found in Toccoa, but stated that identification was impossible given the fragmentary evidence. He noted Grace's disappearance as unresolved, and suggested that both she and Daniel had likely perished amid their turbulent circumstances. The file was closed, not as a solved case, but as one forever suspended in moral grayness. Grace's Veracruz property was sold under the supervision of her New Orleans attorney, and the proceeds were transferred to the Mexican address she had provided. McBride, meanwhile, kept her letter sealed among his private papers, instructing that it be opened only after his death. He never spoke of it to anyone. Years passed. McBride retired, living out his last days on a quiet mountain farm. When he died in 1923, his son discovered the sealed envelope among his possessions. Shocked by its contents, he turned it over to the county's historical archives, where it remains, a haunting artifact of one of the most enigmatic cases in Appalachian history. As for Grace Hargrove, she was never seen again. Over the years, rumors occasionally surfaced, whispers of an American healer living in remote Mexican villages, a solitary woman with unmatched knowledge of plants who treated the poor without charge. Whether those tales spoke of Grace or another, no one ever knew. She had achieved her final goal to vanish completely, leaving behind only a tangle of unanswered questions. Today, the Grace Hargrove case endures in the Watauga County Archives as one of the most morally intricate mysteries ever recorded. A story without heroes or villains, where truth, justice, and survival blur together like the fog that clings to the Appalachian peaks. It forces us to confront unsettling questions. Where does justice end and vengeance begin? What would any of us do when the law offers no refuge? Grace's tale provides no comfort, no simple moral. Yet it endures precisely because it asks what it means to be human in moments when morality and survival collide. If you've followed this story to its end, thank you for joining this journey through one of the darkest and most haunting chapters of Appalachian history. Stories like this are not told to glorify tragedy, but to remind us that every cold case, every faded record, hides real lives, flawed, frightened, resilient. If Grace's story moved you, consider subscribing to the channel for more forgotten histories. Share your thoughts on her choices, the boundaries of justice, and the price of freedom in a world that offered her none. Until next time, keep searching the shadows where truth and mystery intertwine.